October 31st, 2000 Taipei. Local time 11 at night. Rain came crashing down on the cockpit windshield as the flight moved into position. The next moment, just as it began to speed up, the first officer noticed something. Something didn't look right to him. The runway lights seemed off, but it was too late. The plane was already lined up, already picking up speed, on a runway that should have been empty. But that night, it wasn't. What was there actually? What did the first officer see that night? And most importantly, what happened to all the 83 souls aboard the flight after that? This is the story of Singapore Airlines Flight 006, a tragedy that would shake one of the world's safest airlines forever. 11 o'clock. It started in the darkness. The wind screamed across the wet ground like a warning. Inside the cockpit of Singapore Airlines Flight 006, 3 pilots sat in silence. The rain hit the windows like a hammer. The plane, a sturdy and trusted Boeing 747, was ready to fly from Taipei to Los Angeles. Even in the heavy rain just a few hours earlier, the flight from Singapore to Taipei had gone smoothly. Plus, the captain had more than 11,000 flying hours, and the first officer had more than 2,400 hours. The relief pilot also had over 5,500 hours, so all 3 were experienced and well-rested. But now the weather had changed. Typhoon Xangsane had arrived. The wind was strong. The rain was heavier than before. It was hard to see anything clearly. There was an important notice for pilots. It said that this flight would take runway 06, because runway 05 right was closed for work. That meant no planes could take off or land on it. Only some parts of it were still used to move planes around. That detail would become very important soon. The plane stopped at gate B5. This was close to runway 06, the one they usually used. But because of the storm, the captain had another idea. He wanted to use runway 05 left. The reason? Runway 05 left was longer and wider. It also had better equipment to help in low visibility. But there was a small problem. None of the pilots had used that runway recently. The path to get there was confusing, and the fact that runway 05 right was closed could make the taxi route even harder. Still, the captain believed it was the better choice for lower visibility. The relief pilot went outside to check the plane. The wind pushed against him. The rain soaked him completely. When he came back, he said the ground crew was having trouble because of the weather. The captain saw water on the ground, but he did not mention it. Maybe he thought the others had seen it too. But he did not know one important rule. If there is more than 3 millimeters of standing water, the runway is called contaminated. That changes the crosswind limit. Normally, the plane could handle winds up to 30 knots, but on a contaminated runway, the limit drops to 15 knots. That night, the wind was blowing at 26 knots. If they had talked about the water, they might have canceled the takeoff. But no one said a word. They copied the latest weather message. It said there was heavy rain only. The captain said he would take off. The first officer said he would land the plane in Los Angeles. So on paper, everything looked normal. As they moved through the rain and typhoon, heading toward a runway they thought was safe, they were about to make a terrible mistake. A mistake that would take only seconds and change the fate of hundreds of lives. The rain came down like bullets. Visibility? Less than 500 meters. The monster typhoon was inching closer. Wind howled past the cockpit windows of the aircraft as it pushed back from Bravo 5. But strangely, eerily, no one seemed panicked. The captain's voice, steady and unhurried, filled the cockpit.
Take it slow. Be thorough.
To him, this was just another cautious night. But there was a twist they didn't know. Runway 05 right was under construction. That meant they'd be using runway 05 left instead, with a revised path. And then a simple, chilling moment. ATC radioed,
Singapore 006, taxi runway 05 left via Sierra West Cross, and November Papa.
The first officer paused. He hadn't caught it. A short silence. Then he asked for a repeat. The controller replied. This time the first officer repeated it back correctly. Finally, after that, as they began taxiing, the jet groaned against the wind. The relief pilot said,
Crosswind, it's coming in. The more delay we have, the worse it'll get.
The captain replied, worse if we get out. If not, don't take off, and I'm going to take it slowly here because otherwise we'll skid. Meanwhile, outside, the rain made rivers on the tarmac. Crosswinds slapped the tail of the aircraft, twisting it like a leaf caught in a storm. Still, the captain fought to keep her steady. And that's what's called rudder work in aviation. Constant correction to keep the nose pointed where it should be. Without it, the plane could veer off like a drunk driver in the fog. But there was one problem beyond solution. They could barely see anything ahead. Just 400 meters of blur and water. The captain had to rely on the green centerline lights on the taxiway. And in Taipei, unlike Singapore, all the green lights were on, whether you were meant to follow them or not. Technically, it was a maze with every path lit up. Worse still, Taipei's lighting system didn't meet global standards. There were no blinking runway guard lights to warn them when they were about to enter a live runway, nor any working ground radar. The airport had raised a demand for it before, but the money never came through. So the tower couldn't actually see anything beyond 500 meters. But the crew didn't know that. They thought someone had eyes on them. So when, at 23 minutes and 15 seconds past 11, they received final clearance. Singapore 006, cleared for takeoff. The pilots confidently proceeded with the aircraft. And as they rolled closer and closer to their runway, trusting lights that led everywhere, trusting eyes that weren't there, something horrifying was waiting in the dark. Then the big Boeing plane slowly turned toward its runway. But that's what the pilots thought. The truth was, it wasn't the runway they were scheduled to enter. As a result, just after the entry, large concrete blocks were up ahead, which were hard to see from a distance because of the heavy rain. Steamrollers, excavators, and heavy machinery, all was standing in the dark, parked on that runway. But how is this possible? Actually, after that turn, the flight was aligned, but with the wrong runway. They were supposed to take off from the runway 05 left. Instead, the plane entered the runway 05 right, which runs parallel to the left one. And what happened next was this. At exactly 17 minutes past 11, the captain muttered something chilling.
There is something there.
And then, impact. The aircraft slammed into barriers and heavy construction equipment parked on an active runway. The left engines were ripped off like tin cans under a steamroller. The plane twisted violently, the tail snapping. The cabin spun like a top, fuel tanks ruptured, fire burst out. And then, a chilling explosion. But rewind the clock a few minutes and none of this should have happened. They were supposed to taxi straight a few hundred meters and line up on runway 05 left. Instead, the plane turned right early for a runway that was a construction zone. But why? The captain, battling winds from the side, focused on the green taxiway lights. In Singapore, those green lights are a lifeline. They guide aircraft smoothly to safety. But in Taipei, all taxi lights were green, so it became confusing. To make it worse, the correct path toward the real runway had barely any lights. Only 4 worked, while 16 were supposed to. The first bulb likely never came on, the second, too dim to matter. And so the captain trusted only what he could see. The brighter path, the green lights, the familiar threshold markings. How would he understand what he followed was the wrong trail? But what were the other pilots doing? The first officer was busy flipping through the departure checklist. The relief pilot, eyes glued to crosswind data, so no one double-checked where they were. Only the paravisual display, a tool that's supposed to guide you like train tracks into the sky, wasn't lit. When the first officer noticed that, all he said was, "The PVD hasn't lined up yet." But the relief pilot waved it off. "It's not available. We still have more than 45 degrees to turn." And that was a wrong calculation. It wasn't working simply because they weren't even on the right runway. At 11:16 and 23 seconds, the captain confirmed,
Never mind. I can see the runway okay.
A moment later, the wheels were about to leave the ground, but not for long. Seconds into the roll, the nose smashed into heavy machinery. Barriers, pits, giant steamrollers that lined what should have been a safe taxi path. Inside, passengers screamed, doors opened. But the wind outside was merciless. Violent gusts blew inflatable slides against the body of the plane. Some deployed inside the cabin. Others refused to open. Panic turned to paralysis. 83 lives were lost in several minutes. 39 people were left with life-changing injuries, and yet all 3 pilots survived. The black boxes were found quickly. The investigation moved fast. But what it uncovered raised even more troubling questions. And the truth wasn't simple, it rarely is. Firstly, the ATIS never mentioned any runway contamination. Plus, it had been raining hard all day. Other airlines had already considered the runway contaminated, adjusting their takeoff safety margins accordingly. But not Singapore Airlines. If its crew had done the same, they weren't cleared for takeoff at all. And there was another detail, one small omission in the radio call that made all the difference. When ground control handed them off to tower, the first officer was told to
Continue, hold short, runway 05 left.
It sounded normal, but it skipped a key phrase. The instructions should have explicitly told them to cross runway 05 right. Without that, the crew made an assumption, and assumptions are dangerous on wet runways in a typhoon. Had either pilot glanced to the right during that turn, they might have noticed something out of place. But every pilot was busy with their own task, and moreover, even before takeoff, the cockpit gave warnings. The plane tried to speak. The question is, why didn't anyone listen? And why was the runway full of confusing lightings? Could better cockpit cross-checks or communication among pilots have stopped this accident? Tell us in the comments below. If this analysis made you think, like, subscribe, and share your views in the comments, because understanding these factors can save lives.